There you go. And all right, should be recording. Yep.
Yeah, so what you just brought up really intrigues me because
Oh, I just
one
started the
level I'm
recording. So
okay.
yeah, I just brought up that we're starting a group called the International Literacy Educators Coalition. Educators around the world, and we have people from literally around the world, forming to push back on the top-down mandates. And Dave said what a wonderful idea this was, and he was going to explain.
Excuse me, I didn't say that. I, I I I appreciate that. I appreciate what you're doing, but I want to drill into it a little bit. I mean, when we got started, one of your first two items, in fact, on our list of many things that we wanted to talk about was the importance of respectful academic dialogue. And that was your number one item. And your number two item was the importance of varying views, differing philosophies and perspectives. And yet, when you talk about this group, I mean, what you said, push back on the mandates, that's reasonable. I mean, I think we all had to challenge the mandates because they're overgeneralized, and we'll drill into that as we go forward. But
Drill is such an
uh,
interesting word that you use, David.
what's that?
Drill, the word drill. That's kind of
Yeah,
an aggressive word.
well, I mean, get into its core. Let's put it that way. So I don't mean to offend with any particular
No, you're
use of
not
words.
offending.
My intention is to get deeper. Um, so the notion of the way that you just put it, to push back on mandates, makes perfect sense. In one of your messages to me, you called it push back on the smear campaign that's been taking place, right? And that, as if I think the way you put it was, against those who use real reading science, right?
Yep.
It seems to me that's kind of in contradiction with what our intention here is there, to suggest that they're not using real reading science, or that their campaign is a smear. I mean, the place I'm coming from, as I meet you and as I meet them, is that I think we're all got good intentions. We're all
Yes, I agree
well-meaning
with
human
that.
beings who really care about children and who recognize that a lot of children are having life difficulties as a consequence of their takeoff into reading, and with their problems related to reading, and that we all have an interest in changing that and improving the situations in which that's occurring, improving how education functions with respect to that, and that because of what we've learned in our different silos, we have different mental models of what the problem is. And therefore, because we conceptualize the problem differently, we have entirely different conceptions of how to deal with the problem. That doesn't make us good, bad, or otherwise. That just makes us different. And it seems to me that the opportunity that we have, that you and I have, is to kind of get underneath like we started with the last time, kind of get underneath the ping ponging back and forth at these high level abstract beliefs, and get down into the granular assumptions that these differences are based on.
To respond, I agree absolutely. And I love hearing the different views. These different views, and I was thinking about that this week, even if I don't agree with them, really causes me to think and define what I do believe and why it is. And I did a
Right.
lot of that since our last conversation. And that's the importance of hearing different views. The term smear campaign is not one that I came up with, although I wish I would have. It was by Richard Mayer, and describing the inability or to engage in dialogue rather than address the issues. It's easier just to say they're stupid, they're dumb. The Emily Hanford approach, just smear people or uh, um, describe them in ways, straw man campaign, describe them in
Yeah.
ways they aren't. And that really does get in the way of solving the problem.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I mean, you could say the same. This problem with reading is modeled right through our politics. This same kind of demonization of each other that
Oh, yes,
keeps us from
exactly.
having a dialogue, right? So
It's a
that's why
reflection of the current dialogue. Yes.
it's so important to get away from these big sweeping generalizations and get down into the molecules, molecular level of assumptions, where the differences are that everything else is kind of an explicate unfolding from. So I'm hoping that we can do that.
Right. And one of the issues as far as real science versus reading science, we call it real science because the principles used to define the problem with many of the science of reading advocates here are opposite or opposed to their principles of science of reading, meaning that they use I thinkisms and anecdotal evidence to define the problem and to define the solution. Here in Minnesota, they define the problem based on a representative's own experience. My children didn't learn. I didn't learn to read. Therefore, the whole system is bad. It's
Yeah,
that
but on
kind
the
of
other side of that, you've got Stanovich and Talal and a group, Merznick and neuroscientists who are drilling down into the, real time fMRI and other types of scans of the neuronal activity involved in reading that they're grounding certain assumptions on, right? So yes, there are certainly that's what I meant by the high level sweeping belief systems that get thrown back and forth. Let's agree that all that needs to get set aside, and none of that's helpful, and get down to a much deeper component level understanding of what it is that we're saying reading is, and the challenges of reading, and how to teach reading, and all that kind of stuff, so that we can get past these belief systems and get down into something that's more granular. I question whether or not either side, I mean, both sides are, quote, real science inside their paradigms. It's their paradigms that are different, and therefore their science comes up with different results.
And I would say that not embracing all scientific evidence, which science of reading advocates often do, and basing the conditions on anecdotal evidence and I thinkisms, that's not real science.
For sure, but that's only a small part of the
But
quote reading science world.
that small part, though, are the decision makers. They're the superintendents. They're the state legislature.
But that's a bleed of category between the scientists behind this and the administrators that are sloppily quoting and morphing what the science says into what will reinforce their belief systems. That's
But
not the
who
same
are the
thing.
decision makers? The decision makers tend to be state legislatures, tend to be lobbying groups, tend to be publishing companies that are there to make money off our struggling readers.
No difference with you, but that's not the place to engage the argument. That's what I'm saying. They're going to do what they're going to do. You're not going to persuade them. You're not going to forcefully overturn them. You're going to have to get to some deeper, more granular understanding that persuades the science that persuades them.
I agree with you that pure reason is not going to persuade them. Pure logic or scientific evidence is not going to persuade them.
They believe they have science on their side.
Yes,
look at
they
Emily
do
Hanford
that.
and their whole science of reading thing, and
They
it's
do
all
that
about.
by excluding the real literacy scientists. Of course, Emily Hanford believes what she's doing. How many real literacy experts did she involve? And that's the problem here in the state of Minnesota when they came up with the READ Act. They had people from ed psychology and they had expert methodologists, but real literacy experts, people with a background and training and scholarly work and research in literacy were excluded.
Look, there's all kinds of noise. The question is, what are we going to do to change the deeper signal that might have some way to getting through that noise? And I think we have to ignore the noise and kind of get underneath it. And we start by saying, look, good people can disagree. Different scientists, when a scientist grabs the elephant's trunk, another one grabs the tail, they're going to have a different view of the elephant, right? So I think it's possible for everybody to be coming from a good place, and for different science to seem to be in conflict because they're looking at different parts of the same animal, so to speak, so that there's no this is right science and that's right science. They could both be right science and be in conflict with each other because we're not deep enough yet. Like many times in history of science, right? There's been conflicts that get resolved when a new paradigm comes along that gets underneath and includes the both that seem to be separate.
And that's why I include, by the way, science is different than I thinkisms. And using
of course, I already said that.
And that's the problem. It's not an organization like the International Literacy Association, the National Council of Teachers of English. They've been around for decades, 100 years. And they have researchers of all varieties, and they have varying points of view. Those are good organizations. Thousands of scholars, researchers, parents, and teachers. Do you think they were consulted with the science of reading and the READ Act? Hell no.
Well, I only know during my phase, during the Children of the Code thing, I interviewed what I thought to be at the time kind of about 100 of the leading scholars and scientists in the field of reading. And I reached out to a number of, I talked to Ellington at length. I probably spent 4 hours with Ellington. And I went on to look to Goodman and others that were representing the side. And because they didn't think that I was going to end up with a 50-50 fair representation, they didn't want to talk to me, right? And at the same time, I had the Secretary of Education telling the head of the IES to stop me from talking to nuts like Allington, right? That I shouldn't be talking to those bozos, or what the language they actually used was know nothings, right?
And
So
I'm sure I'm in that list of nuts and know nothings to some.
yeah, exactly. But what I want to say is that I'm here talking to you because I think you've got something valuable to say. I think that you've learned things that can be helpful. But at the same time, I don't want to dismiss what they have to say. I don't want to dismiss what you have to say. I want to find a place, because I think there is a place that's kind of underneath in the granules, underneath how you think and how they think, that's actually the same. And that we, if we can get to that place, we can reconcile these paradigms instead of them paralyzing progress.
Excellent point. And I think the thing we have the same is we want all children to develop their full literacy potential. I think that is a good starting place.
Yep, for sure. Okay, well, so we've talked about kind of the orientation to this, right? That good people can agree, and good people can disagree, and that we got to treat each other with respect and learn underneath our differences, not stay up at the level of throwing our opinion stuff at each other.
And the importance of hearing different ideas. I love online when people just really hammer me and say you're wrong because this, that, and the other thing. That really causes me to think.
Yep.
And I separate the name calling from people that have very good ideas.
Yeah, it's the substance, not the reputation.
And
It's
if
not
we're,
the
if we're
credential.
truly thinking, our views evolve. If we're not thinking, we stay pretty static. But if we're continuing to learn and to think and to listen, our ideas continue to evolve.
Yep, which is another word for learning. Yeah.
Oh, learning. Yeah, very good, David.
Thinking is a modality of learning, right? Otherwise, anyway.
Anyway,
So we wanted to talk about beginning reading instruction. I don't know whether we need to. We talked last time about what is reading, and we both had different things that I think are the same, but that we couldn't quite come to some uniform, common description. You were, the creation of meaning from print, and I was artificially inseminated virtual language experience, which you've had problems with. I'm not trying to be jargonesque. I'm trying to be concise.
Yep.
But let's put aside that. The next thing we kind of touched on was the artificiality. We got stuck on that, but let's push that aside for a bit and move on to, you suggested we make this conversation today about beginning reading. And I'd like to do that, but in order to get to beginning reading, I think we need to talk about what are the challenges of learning to read. Forget about before we can talk about instruction. Ultimately, instruction is a way to conduct people through the challenges of learning to read. How could it not be? So what are the challenges involved in learning to read?
Well, and again, think about how people learn to speak. All right. They learn to speak. It's not a natural process. If you put two people on an island, or one person, a thought experiment with no language, that person would not learn to speak. Matter of fact, if they are not exposed to language within a certain amount of time, they're not ever able to learn how to speak. If you put two people on the island, eventually they would make sounds and motions, and they would have some way of communicating. People learn to speak because they are immersed in the speaking and listening condition. Now,
They're
learning how to learn,
participating.
yeah, they're participating, and it's an authentic situation, and people are responding to that. They're not expecting it to be perfect. Learning to write is similar, not the same, but similar. Again, same people on a desert island with writing utensils, eventually they would learn how to use these things to create some form of written communication. The difference is one occurs slower and needs more instruction. One occurs faster and needs less instruction because you are immersed in it all day, every day. So back to what are the challenges of learning
So
to
before we go there, let me say, with respect to the speaking and literacy case that you just made, um, we've had some, depending on which cognitive anthropologist that you subscribe to, we've been speaking oral. We have had oral language for at least 100,000 years, as is proven by our articulatory physics, right? The physics of our articulatory system has been evolved to the state that it could produce rapid speech in the way that we do for about 100,000 years. There's arguments that the genetic infrastructure of speech is closer to 1 million years old. So whether you're talking about 100,000 or 1 million years, we've had an evolutionary arc to learning to speak. And that you could argue, and I do argue with people like Terence Deacon, who wrote The Symbolic Species, which is a study of the cognitive anthropology of language, right, and the neuroscience of language, that um, language is the invention that invented humanity, in the sense that we are a kind of being that we couldn't be without language. It's deeply fused into what it means to be human. So from the get-go, I mean, there's no, except for aberrant, genetically disabled folks, there's no such thing as a non-speaking human. Those kind of humans don't exist anymore. It's common to the human being. There's all kinds of populations, tribal populations in the world that are not literate, that are illiterate, that didn't invent language. So they're not kind of apple to apple in that sense, right?
it's an interesting philosophical argument. I mean, our ability to speak has shaped our brain, absolutely. Just
Yeah.
our ability, like our ability to write has shaped our brain. And in a thousand
But
years,
our ability to write, I mean,
in a
for
thousand
example,
years, we'll say that our ability to use the internet at early ages has shaped our brain. Absolutely.
yeah, sure. Everything we do shapes our brain. Well, there's not a second of thought, of attention, of existence that doesn't
Yes,
change or alter our
neuroplasticity,
brain.
but I mean
So
shaping our human brain or evolutionary brain. Yes.
no, but in evolutionary time is different. I mean, if you take, for example, the
Yeah, I
person who
agree with that. Evolutionary
discovered the English writing, well, it was 5,000 people 500 years ago that could speak and read English. I mean, it's a brand new phenomenon. It's not the same thing as 100,000 years or 500,000 years. It's a relatively new phenomena, writing and
We're
reading.
getting off on a tangent here, David.
Well, you're trying to make these things as if they're kind of the same thing, from this to this, and I'm trying to say they're not. They're very different.
Well, I said they are different, but there are similarities. There are
Yeah,
similarities. I said that you said that learning to speak is natural, it's innate. And I said it's only innate if you are interacting with other people.
right. Which
If
is
you're
the
interacting,
condition of human beings are communal people. We don't live
absolutely,
by ourselves. We can't.
absolutely.
We'd die if we were just born and left in the desert, right? So
And learning to use some symbol to communicate this oral speaking, that would be just as innate over time, but take time. So,
it hasn't had anywhere near the evolutionary time it
well,
takes to
no, it
instantiate
hasn't.
that as a
It,
brain.
it hasn't.
So it's,
But you're trying to say this kind of learning is different than that kind of learning.
well,
And
it is
I,
different than that kind
I
of learning.
look at it, well, no more than learning to play tennis is different from learning to play croquet or chess or something else. We're taking the complex act of reading and try to break it down into its little parts and put it back together again. That is not how reading occurs. Reading is not reading without meaning. And you cannot take a complex act and break it down into its little parts and try to Humpty Dumpty it together again to create a reader. And
Yeah.
that's
Well,
often
we've
what
got to
happens.
do that with our assumptions, though, right? I mean, when you say croquet is the same as chess, whoa. I mean, one requires a massive amount of mental interpretation of what's going on, and the other one is a physical kinesthetic learning with very little mental
Yes, they're
knowledge of
different.
the game, so to speak. They're
Absolutely.
entirely different.
I didn't
Right?
say learning to play croquet is the same as learning to play chess, but I said learning is learning. They're different things in different forms. And
Yeah,
I,
I do think it's important that we make a distinction between different kinds of learning challenges, and that's where we started this part of the conversation. What are the learning
challenges in
challenges
learning how to
involved in
read.
learning to
Okay,
read?
challenges in learning how to read without getting too esoteric. I'm picturing my audience here as parents and teachers going, "What?
You
Neuroimaging?"
know, I understand that you're concerned about that. I think that it's actually important for people to see us as we differ our way towards some kind of a common
Agreement.
understanding, or realize that we can't get there, because this is the problem they're facing in their worlds.
I like your term, differ our way to a common understanding. Good term. I'm going to use that one.
You're free to do that.
And I'll pretend I came up with it.
That's great with me too. I don't have any ownership of this stuff.
Okay. All right. Where are we at, David? I'm sorry. I do
Well,
enjoy this
we're back
conversation.
to beginning to read. One of the ways that a question I have that might open the door, and if you don't feel like this is a good question, we can stop there. I think
Nope.
I shared in a post with you earlier that this research citation that Dennehy gave at a conference on reading sciences, neuroscientist, and he's referring to something that's commonly cited, which is that in phonetic languages, like, for example, Italian, children go from zero to being able to read in 3 months. It takes 2 to 3 years in English. Why is there a difference?
You know, I can't explain a site that I haven't looked at. I know I disagree with a lot of Dennehy stuff. I know it is just because it's brain research doesn't mean it's something special. There's a lot
That
of
wouldn't be brain research. That would be just educational research. So I would assume that in your international gatherings, you're aware of the difference in um, orthographic depths relationship to the time it takes people to read.
I'm not a spokesperson for an international organization. I know that I am. Uh, but the point being is that just because someone does a certain type of research and is cited doesn't mean that it's good. It's
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay.
research.
So would you, in your knowledge, is there a difference in how long it takes Italian or Spanish to read and English to read?
In my knowledge, there's differences between language that is more rules based, like Italian, and language that's a little kooky, like English. There's a little difference, yes.
A little difference.
Yeah.
So when he's talking about a magnitude of 10, for example, 3 months, 3 years, that doesn't make any sense to you.
And again, I can't respond to any research that I have not looked at.
Okay.
Just like there's a lot of research that you have to look at subject size and what are they measuring.
Oh, I grant you. I grant you. I grant you.
I can't respond to anything I haven't read.
Okay.
That happens all the time. People say, well, research is showing that. And well,
Yeah,
what?
I understand. I understand it. I don't want to use that pushback myself with stuff that you throw, right? I mean, that I understand that it's kind of like, pick your Bible interpretation when it comes to reading research today, right? Is that there's many different ways to interpret, and all kinds of variables as to whether or not any particular thing has really got general relevance.
So back to
So let
your
me,
question.
yeah, back to my question. So, uh, if kids could look at a word from the time they were born, they could look at a written word and it would immediately pop into their head and they would hear it, so to speak, and they would know what it means. Would they, how would they learn? What would they need to do to learn to read?
Well, we as human beings, we never see single words floating in space out of context. A word
Yes,
is always found in the context of a sentence, a sign, or a label, or something.
sure.
So words always carry meaning of some sort.
Yep. That's their point. Yeah.
So how would they learn
But
that word in the context of something or other. Children, many children often learn to read in the terms of logos or signs, McDonald's, hamburger, milk, that sort of thing, because they're
Yeah,
seeing
but
words.
that's label recognition.
That's putting a word in the context of a label. Yes. And then seeing that word someplace else.
That's like object naming.
Not quite,
Like,
but you're asking, how do you learn a word? How do you learn to recognize that that word is milk? Oh, I've seen milk on that milk carton. Yeah. You're pausing, you're thinking.
well, I didn't mean to suggest in my question that it was an isolated word. Let's take a string of words. A kid can look at a sentence full of words and boom, 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 the words just go bang, 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 and they pop into their head and they hear them and they know what they mean, right? What else is involved in learning to read?
What else is involved in learning to read?
If they
Well,
could do that, what else would they need?
what would you say what they need?
If they can look at a word and it pops into their head
They
and
know what
they
it means.
recognize
They know what
they
it
know what it
means.
means, right? And they're able to just fly down the stream of doing that, they're reading.
Yep.
They don't need anything, they don't need anything else. They can now use that to bootstrap learning thereafter.
Yep.
Yep. You agree?
If they learned what words are and mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
If when they look at it, if as soon as they look at it, it pops into their head,
If
right?
they recognize what a word is, what it means, yes, just like as I recognize an oral word, once I know what that means, yes,
Okay.
I could
So
string
so
those
I guess
together.
so my point is then our instructional, our attempt to teach them to read, so to speak, all of our strategies, the ultimate aim is that, isn't it?
To
That
be able
when they
to be able
to
to
be able
create
to
meaning,
scan a series of words and have them pop right into their head and follow the meaning.
not a series of words, to create meaning. So as we recognize words, yes, we want them to use letter clues initially to recognize
I
the
didn't say anything about letters. I was saying they're looking at where they're just their eyes are touching on a word and the next word, the next word, the next word. The words are going bang, bang, bang in their head. They're recognizing them, they understand the meaning, and they're flying down the track of that sentence.
think about, the eye movement research says we don't recognize words like that. Our eyes are going like this constantly back and forth. So we're not looking at individual words. We're seeing the words in the context of what came
Okay, all right.
before and
I was
after.
trying to set up something else. Yeah, I interviewed Keith Stanovich on eye recognition stuff. And if, by the way, seeing you brought that up, the thing that determines how long somebody stays with their eye fixations as it bounce around inside of a sentence and how they iterate, how they go back and forth in the movement depends on the difficulty of recognizing words.
And it doesn't, well, not quite, not quite. Is it a content word or is it a function word? If it's a content word which has meaning, they tend to fixate on it. If it's a function word like of, the, and, they tend to skip over it. And expert readers fixate on fewer words. So whether the word is difficult or not, the length of the word doesn't determine eye fixation or the duration of
No,
fixation.
but you're assuming that by difficulty I mean length or complexity. I mean difficulty as it's experienced, meaning there's a stutter involved in recognition from the reader's perspective, not from an analytical perspective of the word.
A stutter, meaning
Yeah,
that
in other words, the the longer it takes somebody to recognize a word, the more time that their eyes will stay fixated on it.
well, if they're not recognizing it, then they are identifying it, meaning I see the word, I don't recognize it, I need to employ some cognitive strategy, which is context, word parts, analogy, or semantics, or letter clues. Yes, if they don't recognize it immediately, then they employ some strategy. The
which is
reason we
which is
teach word identification strategies is so the process becomes automatic. That's why we teach phonics.
so my point is if when they looked at a word, it popped right into their mind, would you
They
still
recognize it.
teach? They immediately recognize the word, right?
Yep,
Would they need to go looking around for context clues?
absolutely. Because I could say to you, run, what does that mean? And you'd say, oh, to move fast. Well, run could be a run in my stockings. Run could be a home run. Run could
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah. But
alteration.
I'm talking about, I'm reading a sentence. I'm reading a sentence. I'm following the flow of the meaning. I now recognize the next word. Do I
Yeah,
have to go anywhere else? Why would I go anywhere else?
you wouldn't. You're moving on to the next
All
word.
right. So my point is that if you're following the flow of meaning and you encounter the next word in the sequence of a sentence, for example, and you recognize it, then you don't have any need to go extraneous to the word in order to keep moving.
You're tending to think word by word. You know, our foveal and parafoveal is kind of like this. We can see things very clearly, just 3 to 6 letters at a time. And
Yeah.
the parafoveal is about 24 letters ahead that we see very fuzzily. And then there's the peripheral. So we're seeing just little bits of parts, and our brain is taking snapshots. So we're constantly looking ahead in our periphery to see what the next word is.
Yeah, that's not, I understand what you're saying. Like I said, I spent quite a bit of time with the guy who originated the whole eye tracking science at UMass, including his research about what you've just described. I'm aware of that. I'm saying that if I'm following the flow of meaning in a sentence and my eyes now come to the next word in the flow of what I'm reading, and I get that word, it pops right into my mind. Do I have to go off for any other reason or just move on to the next word?
Oh, you're constantly on to the next word. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So my point being is that the all of the extraneous to the word search for context clues is to help me understand the word, help me recognize the word if I don't, in your view.
Now, is this a question that has a point behind it? Or
Well,
is it a question for a question's sake?
no, no, it's a question. Let me back up and ask the question. When you encounter a word that you don't recognize, what do we want readers to do?
We want readers to use some sort of word identification strategy. So we
And what
ask,
I'm so exactly, so I'm pivoting off of that. I'm saying your cloud of possible word identification strategies,
for
they all only exist because they become relevant to disambiguating or to recognizing an unfamiliar word.
disambiguating, seeing a word in context that's in their lexicon, but they don't recognize it. Yes, so they have to identify what that word is.
Or later they may not know the word at all. They're learning it for the first time while reading, right? So it's part of the way that it becomes part of their lexicon.
Yes, but identification by its nature is the word is in your lexicon and you have to have some strategy to access it. Now, we read all the time words that we don't recognize, and we often skip over them as long as we're still creating meaning. Have you ever read a textbook and there's a new word yet you don't quite know what it is, but you're gathering meaning, so you skip right over it? That's
Sure,
very
sure.
common.
Yeah. One of the ways that I got into this, by the way, was recognizing that I was often reading something that I was passionately interested in and deeply engaged in, and then somehow I'd wake up to find that I'd turned a page or two and somehow completely dropped out. Right,
Yes.
and the more people I talked to about that, the more that was a pretty common experience. Well, how did that happen? It's an erosion of attention engagement that happens from blowing off words you don't recognize.
Or the other case too, you're not recognizing it, but you're still creating meaning and you keep on going.
Yeah,
And,
with the meaning can be a tangent if you don't anyway.
and
This
then
itself is a tangent.
this
back to where we were going, right? So, where we want to talk about is the beginning reading instruction, and the whole point of reading instruction is to mentally equip a beginning reader with the mental tools, reflexes, whatever you want to call them, to employ when they encounter a word that they don't understand or they don't recognize, so that they can keep moving. They can keep making meaning. Is
That
that
is,
right?
that's what's called the reading readiness approach, that we have to make children ready to be able to read. We have to give them the tools before we let them read. And
Yeah,
that's an
I actually,
opposition to an emergent approach.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I look forward to us getting into that at a subsequent date because I have a different take on that too. But to this particular point, when you said the difference between identification and recognition requires the employment of these mental cognitive strategies, those cognitive strategies have to have been learned before that point.
To recognize a word, the cognitive strategies have to be learned before the point. To be able to identify a word, cognitive.
No, no, you said the difference between identification and recognition, right,
Mhm.
would involve cognitive strategies.
Involve cognitive
Yep.
strategies consciously employed. Yes.
Right, right. Okay. So that presupposes that those cognitive strategies that are consciously employed were previously learned so that they're available at that point that we're describing.
They become more available. For example, if we said the monkey ate a buck, most kids would kind of figure out, well, banana fits in there. But through explicit instruction, that becomes more conscious and it becomes a strategy. In the same way, if they saw a word topping and they recognize the OP phonogram, there would be some natural inclination to look at patterns. But through direct instruction, that becomes a more conscious strategy.
Right. So to my point, in the simple part of the question was there is a front loaded training involved in getting somebody. That's what reading and beginning reading instruction is about, is to provide these cognitive, whether we're talking about decoding and the phonics drill and kill on the one side, or we're talking about going out to pictures and context cues and meaning priming strategies from what I have read prior to this or in the previous sentence or whatever, right? We're still talking about employing these tactics, these strategies to be able to work through a stoppage that is occasioned by an unfamiliar word.
I do not believe they have to be front loaded. They don't have to be front loaded. We engage in instruction to develop students'
Well,
ability.
if you gave a pick a book, if you give it to a 5-year-old, will they have the strategies necessary without having been taught to be able to read?
Not a book, and you wouldn't give a book to a
Okay,
5-year-old.
whatever. When you say beginning
Developmentally
reading
appropriate.
instruction, doesn't beginning reading instruction involve teaching them how to deal with an unfamiliar word?
Beginning reading instruction, first it emerges. This is a word. This is the concept of a word, the concept of reading left to right, the concept of letters and sounds. Those are the concepts you begin to teach in developmentally appropriate ways. When they're ready for it, then you begin to teach letter sounds within the context of real books.
But all of those things that are learnings are guiding the learning so as to prepare them to be able to deal with an unfamiliar word later.
uh, Unfamiliar words, we develop their ability to recognize.
But develop their ability is the learning. How do you develop their ability without them learning?
It's not that they're learning something new. They have the innate ability to do this. Absolutely. Absolutely. Education means to educe, to draw forth. The human brain naturally looks for patterns to make sense of the world. That's what they do on a very primitive basis. Yes, they have to be taught letters stand for sounds. Words are composed of sounds. You put the words together. Absolutely. Everyone agrees with that. It's not the what, it's the how and the how much. Everyone agrees phonemic awareness is important. Phonics is important. Everyone agrees with that.
Yeah.
But
And my point is that the reason that we need phonics or we need phonemic awareness or we need context cues or we need picture cues is because when we look at a word, it doesn't pop into our mind. If it did, we wouldn't need that stuff.
well, How do some children learn to read naturally without any instruction at all? That's a very common occurrence. How does that
I don't
happen?
know how common that is.
It's very common. It is
Really?
very common. Absolutely. Some
Yeah.
children learn in
Well,
spite
you'll
of
forgive
what
me,
we
but I
do.
got to take that kind of like Dennehy's thing on Italian, right? I mean, there's nothing I've encountered that would say that many children automatically read without any guidance or support or instruction, on their own. I would think that children who have a very powerful vocabulary, who have a rapid mental processing capability, who've grown up in an environment that's intellectually rich and complex, and who've been exposed to print throughout their lifetimes in their surrounds, and that have had all the kind of rich early life learning trajectory support systems that can take off with just about any way they're taught, for sure.
Absolutely. And that's more or less what I was saying. It's that
Well, no, that's different
background.
than that. Whether a lot of kids could do that. I mean,
It is common. I'll look it up and give you how common that is. I don't know if they've done a study on that. And that may be anecdotal because, I used to work in a gifted
sounded
education,
sounded that way.
but you cannot separate, vocabulary is the best predictor of future reading achievement. That means children have been exposed in rich literacy environments. They've been read to, they've had words pointed out, and so they have less need of formalized instruction to begin the reading.
Yeah, and even reading to them is less important than the language bath in general. That's exercising the implicit phonemic distinctions it takes to make meaning out of a word stream, or oral word stream. So, like the Hart Risley work and all the work since then on language exposure differences between children, and some kids that come from taciturn and some kids that come from highly talkative parents, and the correlates between that and reading later, regardless of reading instruction in the interim. So yeah, language exposure is the big one for sure.
Yep. And if your language exposure matches that of school-based language, you're going to be more successful.
Yep, yep, yep.
And that's one of
Sure.
the reasons why there is sometimes the achievement gap. If children's language experience is much different from the school experience, they are going to do less well. Anyway,
Yep.
off on a tangent.
And that's part of the case that the phonics side of the house makes, right? Is that the less ready a child is in terms of their language facility, their speed of processing, I would argue, inserting into that their emotional resilience, the more dependent they are on explicit systematic instruction. Now, you and I could talk about explicit systematic instruction to include context cues and to be paying attention to meaning priming and other things, right, that aren't necessarily as phonics
Yeah,
centric
and
as
the
they
whole
are.
speed of processing thing, I call that into question. It talks, it's like some of these tests that measure students' ability to read in terms of naming letters or numbers. How many could you name in 60 seconds? And that's supposed to be an indicator of their future reading ability. And that does not seem very valid.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah, you're talking about the
things
rapid
like
naming
dibbles.
of
Yeah,
wolf stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I spoke at length with her too. On the one hand, I think that's right that there's a limited traction between that and what we're discussing. On the other hand, I mean, I think it is important to understand that auditory language moves at a certain temporal profile, right? The difference between bat and dad and cat and bat and whatever like that is like a tenth of a second that a brain is paying attention to differences in sound in order to recognize differences in meaning. So there is a speed dynamic involved in processing oral language that written language has got to somewhat work inside the field of in order for attention to stay primed and for meaning to flow. So there is a temporal dynamics to language.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I would think that would be something that would be inside of your wheelhouse and not in a question. Yeah? No?
Yes. And your point is?
Well, you said you disagreed with something about the speed of processing. And my point was the speed of processing is directly related to the amount of attentional resources you can bring to bear, even in oral language, which we just talked about a moment ago as being the undercarriage to reading. So speed of processing is directly related to reading through that same cycle.
Yeah, but how many letters you can name in 60 seconds?
That's different. That's different than the neurologics of a speed of processing that I was referring to. You went off into that. I didn't. I said
Okay.
the speed of the neurological speed of processing, which is what predicts oral language facility.
Your speed of processing anything, yes, it affects what you're doing. But aside from that, okay, your ability to see the ball off the hands of the pitcher, to see it quickly, enables you to hit the ball sooner. Yes, being able to see things quickly.
Yeah, yeah. So speed,
Taking
that
all
was my
those
point. Speed of processing, right? So what causes speed of processing is language exposure and complexity of environment and the challenges in an early learning environment. That those are all part of what speeds up the processing to a level that gets it more proximally ready for reading.
exposure to these things is important. To take what you said and maybe put it into a more basic, there's basic and applied research. But yes, exposure to language is important. Exposure to words, exposure to books, those are important.
Yeah, and I don't want to be argumentative just to be argumentative, but when we use a word like exposure, you can talk about exposing film or exposing things that are inert. Here, we're always talking about participation. We're talking about a mental participation process at all, always, whether we're talking about eyes moving around in a field, the foveal field, or we're talking about our auditory nerve and our auditory processing making distinctions in a phonemic stream. We're still talking about a neurological participation, not a passive reception.
There are levels of exposure from simply hearing and being involved to speaking to seeing. Absolutely. There's levels of exposure. But to have no exposure versus passive exposure, well, passive exposure is better than no exposure. Passive exposure with
Sure,
more. So
sure.
it's
But
levels of exposure.
yeah, well, it's levels of exposure that engender the right kind of participation.
Levels of
And
exposure. More participation is better than less participation.
yeah, yeah,
Exposure, there are different levels. Absolutely. Just like as you read, there are levels of engagement. To read or to listen, that's why I tell my students you must take notes because it keeps you engaged. You cannot passively absorb by listening. You cannot passively absorb by reading without being engaged somehow.
yeah. I'm not going to argue with you on that one. I think, yeah,
I don't want to
that.
argue. I
Well,
want everyone to love each other, David.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, arguments don't necessarily mean we don't love each other. It means that we're differing with each other in a way that produces learning, right? So
Are
that's
you saying you don't want people to love each other? You're against love?
not me. I think the biggest problem with love is unhealthy learning. So
Okay.
that's a different wheelhouse, different conversation. So back to our theme of today was beginning reading instruction, and I guess the point that I was trying to make is that everything about phonics and everything about what you're describing as necessary are consequences of the fact that the written language is not transparent to meaning.
Well, let me ask you this. What should beginning reading instruction look like? Say you walked into a kindergarten classroom or preschool. What should beginning reading instruction look like?
Well, um,
That is
there's a
the heart of
difference
the
between,
question.
yeah, for me, it would be about creating highly personalized, meaningful takeoff pathways through. I actually built a thing called Sentence Builder once, where we'd interview kids, we'd find out the name of their mom, their dad, their favorite dog, their cat, the street they lived on, everything we could about them, and then construct passages that were full of the things they already knew as a takeoff for them, right? So I think that the meaning centricity is really key. Personal relevance is ideal and optimal. And the further we go, you mentioned earlier the disconnect between the language they may have at home and the language that's in school. The Whatever the language gap is, whether it's because of the language used by the teacher or the language used in the construction of a book, the greater the language gap is between whatever it is we're using to teach reading and the language that's already native and oral and available to the child, the more we exacerbate the challenge of reading, right?
So to get
So,
back to the heart of the matter, if we come to Mr. David's kindergarten classroom, what would literacy instruction look like?
well, that kind of jumps us to the end. If in my case, it would mean that children are able to touch any word that they encounter and it will unfold and conduct them through learning anything they want to learn about it, from its how to pronounce it and how to sound it out, to what it means generally and what it means specifically in this context, its etymology, its definite, its elaborations, its history, anything that's imaginably relatable to that word at the moment that they're stuttering or stumbling on it is available to them by touching it.
So that's an end state. What are the steps to get to that end state? Is, I guess, is what
Well,
I'm driving at. Those are wonderful goals, but how do we get there?
well,
What
I already built
activities
it.
would I see if I came to your classroom? What things
Yeah,
would be
well,
going on?
we would teach kids the what I call piques, which is a way of varying the appearance of letters
Okay,
so
so
that
learn,
they don't lose their letter recognition value,
okay, so
right?
they'll be learning about letters. Okay,
Yep, they would learn about letters, and they would learn about letters in a different way, so that, for example, all the letters that they encounter that are silent, like the common silent E, for example, would be gray, and all of the letters that say their letter name would be bold, and
okay.
all of the letters that belong that don't make sounds when they stand alone but make sounds in combination with another letter would be indicated as a in a group, either by having some kind of a line underneath them or touching in some way. So in other words, there'd be a series of visual cues that would reduce the ambiguity in the orthography, and they would use that early stage awareness of how letters sound in the ways that I've just described, and use that in the context of words they already know on sight to build a takeoff ramp that was individual for them.
So it'd be something like this. Boys and girls, today we're going to learn about reducing the ambiguity in orthography of letters. Now, this is, I'm being a little facetious there, but letters are a very abstract thing for a 5-year-old kid. It's an abstraction. Yes, there'd be some of that. Yes, there'd be some of that. Letters turn bold when that that's a very important thing. But you're having students sit and learn things apart from the act of reading.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure
sorry.
that's one very interesting or important thing that could be. But
Yeah,
if that's
yeah,
the extent of reading instruction, you're falling far short, as St. Matthew says, far short of the glory.
yeah.
If that's all you got for early literacy instruction, that's not going to cut it.
I didn't say it was all it had.
Okay.
Like I said, it's a component of it.
But there's many people that want that exclusively, that want just drill and practice and letters, letter sounds.
yeah, but you don't. If you go back to what I said, one of the things that's really important to me is to minimize the amount of pre-training, the abstract knowledge that kids need to learn in order to interpret their way to meaning. So that they're less dependent on the uh, all of the phonics information, all of the strategies for decoding and for structural word inquiry, or for extraneous to the word context cues, that they don't need to go outside as much to get what they need to be able to progress. And they don't need to learn this in the abstract much in advance. Rather, they click on any word they encounter that doesn't make sense to them, that doesn't pop into their mind, and they get help right then. Any word, anytime.
And what would learning to read in a more naturalistic environment look like in a preschool or kindergarten? You would tap into the way that children naturally learn and want to learn. You'd have the teacher reading big books to children. That's a book that's big, pointing to each word. Dan the Duck. You would have phonics lessons in the context of reading those big words. You'd have the teacher writing daily messages, single ones, reading them back, choral reading, echo reading, and pointing out phonics within that context. You'd have children writing letters. Maybe they would use, it's called writing, drawing and writing together. They write their story and the teacher comes back. What's your story about? One sentence. And they read that, they practice reading. These are more naturalistic ways to teach reading. And children actually learn to enjoy books this way, to enjoy writing. Instead of, we're going to give you this stuff that's not very fun, but you need to be made ready so that you can read someday. So it's a difference in approach. One is Humpty Dumptyian, the other is more holistic.
I don't think they're reconcilable. The thing is that if we go back, whole language is an adaptation to the fact that reading is confusing, right? I mean, if you look at where whole language came from and you look where phonics come from, both of them are latter stage adaptations to the fact that people had trouble reading without them. Like the post, King James Big Bang of English literature, explosion into the world, and the beginnings of mass teaching of reading, there was big problems getting people to learn to read. So they came up with phonics. Phonics caused all kinds of problems. They came up with whole language, Horace Mann, all that story stuff. And these two have been arguing back and forth. So on the one hand, we could say for sure, human beings are meaning centric. The sooner they get their traction with meaning, the better off they're going to be, right? So we want to get them up to speed. What's the obstacle to getting up to speed? The fact that words are not intuitively, obviously meaningful when you just look at them. Why are they not? Because of the confusion in the code. If the confusion was, if it was transparent, why would you go outside the word to understand the word?
I'm raising my eyebrow because you obviously don't understand what whole language is. Whole language includes phonics. It's not phonics or whole language. Whole language simply said, and by the way, Kenneth Goodman was not against phonics instruction. Whole language teachers are not against phonics instruction. It simply says we want to keep language as whole and as meaningful as possible.
And I don't have any difference with that. I really
But
don't.
that difference, that's the straw man argument that the science of reading advocates often put up there. They're just teaching children to guess at words.
They're opposed to training kids to guess at words rather
And
than
no one
work them
does
out.
that. For God's sakes, no one teaches children to guess at words.
When you talk about getting context cues rather than working the code to get to word recognition, they would call that guessing.
And here's the thing. Here's where I would kind of even when you sound out a word, they say, does it make sense within the sentence? Even when you're using letters, you go back and say, does that word make sense? So in a sense, they are teaching children to guess just as much as someone using analogy, which is called large unit phonics, or morphography, which is using prefix, suffix, and roots.
But that's all of those things are a hell of an overhead that a kid's got to learn in order to read. They're incredibly abstract overhead.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Would any of it exist if the code was transparent?
If the code was transparent, you'd still be using that stuff. For God's sake.
Why? If you could look at a word, if you looked at a word, does a sight reader need all that stuff on a word they know on sight?
A sight reader, Everyone's a sight reader to some degree. It's whether
Of
more
course, of
or
course.
less.
For absolutely.
Good readers do not look at every letter. Good readers do not
No,
look at every
of course they
word.
don't. Of course they
We're
don't.
going back and forth.
So the question always is, how do you get from an unfamiliar word to it becoming a sight word, right? But my point is that once it is a sight word, you're not going out extraneous to the word into context to try to figure it out. It pops right to mind. So the only reason we would ever teach strategies that are extraneous to the word as a way to recognize the word is because the word's not transparent.
Words don't pop to mind. Meaning pops to mind. Now, I've got one eye that's really bad, so a lot of times I don't catch words correctly. So it's very common for me to misidentify a word, but I'm still creating meaning. And someone calls me, oh, yes, that's right. It was Tuesday and not Thursday. They looked the same. I was still creating meaning. So it's not individual words that are popping into my head, just like when you're talking. It's not individual words, it's meaning.
Yeah, but the meaning is that the meaning at that higher level of comprehension is a construct from the elements that were moving in the stream. Take those elements out, and there's a certain point that whole construct falls apart. If you only heard every fifth word that I said, the meaning that you'd construct would be entirely different than if you heard them all.
But you
Same
would
thing with
still be
reading.
constructing meaning. Stephen Kosir did
Yeah,
some
but
very interesting.
would you be constructing the meaning of that's anywhere approximate to what I'm saying or what I wrote?
Every person is constructing meaning based on what you said. Someone
Everybody's
agrees
constructing
with
meaning
you.
every second of their consciousness. That's not helpful here.
Someone could hear what you're saying and be constructing a totally different meaning.
Yes.
I, who know a lot about literacy, am reading a book. I'm constructing different things than someone who knows little about literacy. If I'm reading about financial analysis, I know nothing about that. The brain is the same. I'm recognizing words, but I'm not creating meaning because there's nothing in my head related to financial stuff.
Well, you're
So
not creating the meaning that's in the book, right? You're creating the meaning of confusion or frustration
I'm
or
not
whatever.
creating any meaning. Meaning does not reside in the word alone. Meaning does not reside in the text alone. It resides in what you bring to it. Stephen Kosir did some very interesting research looking at readers, and he measured the miscues. And those students, fourth grade students, and then I'm summarizing, who actually had more meaningful miscues were compared to those who had accuracy, were 100% accurate. And the meaningful miscues actually comprehended and remembered more because they were reading deep structure versus surface structure. They were going beyond the word and creating meaning. That's what we want our readers to do, not be looking at words, but be creating meaning with print.
I
I
mean,
know.
that would be completely idiosyncratic to the kind of text you're reading. If you're reading something that's instruction that's highly specific, then your accuracy is going to be entirely different than if you're reading something that's more fluffy and amorphous that you can bring multiple interpretations to and still be correct with. That's apples and bananas.
Fluffy and amorphous. You should work with undergraduates sometimes when you have your directions all printed out and they read it and we get 100 different interpretations on my nice explicit directions. Everyone
I,
brings context to what they're trying to create meaning with.
I agree that it's all about meaning making, right?
Yep.
My point was, again, if when say that I think you get hung up on me when I say the word rather than a flow, a stream, right?
Mhm.
But I mean a stream. I don't mean to over particularize into a single elemental word, but I'm tracking a stream of words, right? And from that stream, I'm picking up the elemental meanings of the words. And from that, a larger construct is forming. I'm creating the meaning of the overall of what I'm tracking with, right? So
I see what you're saying.
there's multiple levels going on. And there's only so many misconnects at the elemental level that I can do before it erodes the accuracy of my comprehension of the totality of what I'm tracking with, right? I mean, you get that. We agree with that.
And I would go
Otherwise,
back,
why would I read?
and if I'm understanding you correctly, you put the words together to create meaning. The words create meaning. And The
The
top-down flow
words
of
cue,
information.
words prompt meaning.
Yes.
They trigger. I experience a word, this word and this word and this word. They're all interplaying with one another in the construction of the meaning of the whole that I'm tracking with and flowing with as I'm encountering words. There's a thing that I call the cycle of engagement, right? About foreground and background streams and how an elemental recognition at the foreground stream is changing the background, that is the context for interpreting the meaning flow in the foreground. There's a whole complex process that's going on, but the meaning of the individual words, or the meaning I attribute to the individual words, is playing a fundamental role in the construction of the overall meaning flow that I'm experiencing as I move forward, right?
Do you know what the word graphomorphability is?
Graphomorphability.
Yep.
I don't recognize the word. I would say from its components that you're talking about graphics, an image, and morphability would mean its ability to transform or change.
Not morph like in morphine, but morphins in morphology.
Okay, so the history of its visual form.
I don't know, I just made that word up to demonstrate that word meaning doesn't reside in the word alone.
Yeah, I know that. I know that, but that doesn't exist in a vacuum either. I'm not going to have a mean if I just look at this side of the wall and you look over there and a word pops into your mind, I'm not going to know it what
Yep.
that word is unless you share it either by speaking or writing. So the transfer between your mind and my mind is conducted by a word. It's not that it's not the meaning, it's the transporter, it's the trigger, it's the prompt.
Yes, and I could say run, again, the individual word, but that has a different meaning depending on the context.
For sure. No question.
So, did we agree on anything, David?
I don't know.
It's
I don't know.
certainly interesting.
What I'm trying to get at again is that all of these conversations about reading instruction are wrapped around the lack of transparency of the writing system. That if the writing system was transparent to our minds, we wouldn't go off into phonics or structured word inquiry or morphology or etymology or epistemology or or how to interpret what it might mean from this picture or from that paragraph or the sentence I read before. If the word popped into my mind, I wouldn't need any of that. So that they're all strategies for working around the fact that words are not transparent.
And I think what you mean transparent is they're not rules-based. There are
No.
there are 44 phonemes in the English language and only 27 letters. So
Yeah.
you're saying if we had 44 letters in our alphabet, learning to read would be easier. And I think I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's redo the alphabet.
No, we can't do that now. But
Yes, we can.
but you just opened the door, and I know we have an hour clock, but if I don't care about the clock, unless you got to go, I
Now,
would say we've just come to a point that's very interesting.
well, I think it is. That's because why I brought it up.
Okay. Well, this has been fascinating for me, this particular point. So as you're probably aware, there's been centuries of attempts to try to make the English orthography work the way you've said, right? Theodore Roosevelt passed a presidential order changing the spelling in American government use to try to bring the spelling of the system into some kind of a simpler form that would make it easier for children to read. Benjamin Franklin thought changing the alphabet so that it does what you're talking about, a better correspondence to the phonemes of English speech. If we did that, that would be more important to the future of America than the architecture of the streets in Washington, D.C.
So
Right?
you're making a case against top-down federal interference with teachers' classrooms, and I agree with you. Federal
Well,
government,
no.
government
I'm trying
should
to.
never get
I'm.
involved.
No. What I'm saying is that your point is that yes, if the orthography was transparent, if the letters and sounds didn't have so many variations that you had to deal with, that things would be simpler. So we
It would
started
be
with that.
easier. It would be
It'd be
easier. It wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would be easier.
No, I didn't say it's all. Well, it would be easier, but
Yep.
that easier. the lack of that easier, breeds all kinds of problems in the reading war space, right? If there wouldn't be an argument if kids could look at words and they popped right into their heads. The confusion in the orthography is a root part of all of our arguments. My point, and that just if without going too far down the road, if we just take your thing, it would be easier. Just stay right there. It would be easier. My thing is that if you look at the history of all of this, right, there's been all kinds of attempts to do that, to make it easier, to change the spelling to better fit the alphabet, or change the alphabet to better fit the spelling, to make the characters and the sound system line up so that there was less confusion in it. Dewey, the designer of the American library system, said if we could do this, 2 or 3 years of waste would go out of education from the front end, right? So, but the problem is that every time anybody's tried to do anything, Mark Twain was perfect on this. There was all kinds of people. It's great history of this whole story, this part of the story. The problem, though, is that this always meant that everybody who already knows how to read things the way they are would have to learn to read something in a new way. And nobody wanted to do that. Why would all the powerful people change what they have to do every day in order to accommodate the people that have trouble reading? That's nuts.
It would be easier. It wouldn't solve any problems, but it's a hypothetical because it's never going to happen. Unless
I
you
understand.
become the grand poobah of the universe, it's not going to happen.
Well, but wait a minute. There's a series of assumptions in that. That's the core of what I think can be changed. To your point, this is a beautiful thing. There was a linguist named C.S. Hockett, right, who was the big poobah of linguists before Chomsky. And he said it's easier for people to change their religion than their writing system, right? So there ain't going to be any changes to the writing system. Anyway, I spent a great deal of time interviewing all kinds of people related to spelling reform and all that stuff. And my point was, there's no way we could change the spelling. However, the reason that the spelling got messed up, putting all that aside, the history of the Great Vowel Shift, and when the printing press came in, and the Chancery scribes in England who came up with the weird pair bondings and all that historical stuff, putting that aside, we get to a point where the reason that we can't change it is we think of orthography as a static two-dimensional thing. In other words, if we change the alphabet or we change the spelling, we disconnect history, right? So that's a problem. But
I think people don't want to do it because it's too much trouble and they'd have to relearn things.
right. But what if you could make it so that nobody had to relearn anything, and yet for new learners, they could just touch any word that they're unfamiliar with, and it would be effectively just as transparent.
Transparency is going to make it easier. It's not going to solve all the problems. It
Not
really
going to
is.
solve.
It
Not
makes
gonna
things a little easier, but children still learn to read by creating meaning with print.
Yeah, but creating meaning with print. I mean, you use that. That's way the hell up in the upper atmosphere from the ground of what does it mean to create meaning from print?
That means they see it and it makes sense to them. The dog ran to the store. Oh yeah, the dog ran to the store. Let's find the words within there. Oh, there's dog. Yep. What about store? There's store. Yep. What's the sound at the end of dog? G, g, yeah. So you get the whole, and then it's called whole to part instruction. Then you teach the parts within the context of the whole. That is an overview of what whole language is. Whole to part instruction.
So that depends on them having enough of the words already known to be able to track the meaning well enough to disambiguate a word they don't know.
There you go, disambiguating again. The
All right.
word's in their head. They know what the word means. Absolutely.
Yeah, but the problem of beginning reading instruction is not being able to get up to speed in the flow of meaning, because they're stuttering on too many words they don't recognize.
I wouldn't say that's the problem of reading, but it's an interesting idea.
Well, when you listen to a beginning reader, what do you think's causing the start-stop hesitations in their vocal stream?
If there were one thing, it would be an easy problem to solve. I tutor struggling readers all the time with kindergarten, first grade. I'm
So,
starting to get
what do
next.
you think? So, what do you think causing that stutter, that delay in their flow?
There are many deficits, but I'll tell you one of the deficits, and someone I worked with recently would come to a word and it would stop and would try to sound out the word letter by letter. And it would take her about 10 seconds to identify the word. And then she'd go back and guess to see if it made sense in the sentence. And then she'd go on. So
So my
I
point.
told her instead, I said, let's try just saying blank and keep moving on. She'd say blank, and 2 seconds later, she'd get the word and she'd go back. 10 seconds versus 2 seconds. And again, if it were that,
That would be situation. That would be situation. First of all, you proved my point in your example that it was her. Well, her hesitation was because she stopped on an unfamiliar word.
yes, she could not identify it.
That was my point.
When you say unfamiliar, though, it's in her lexicon. She just didn't recognize it. It's in the dictionary in her head. She just didn't recognize it.
Okay, I'm not talking about an abstract unfamiliar. I'm talking about the experience of unfamiliar, a failure to recognize. So let me not get bogged in the language. So,
well, it's a very important distinction when you say unfamiliar. She doesn't recognize it. She knows the word. She doesn't.
Okay, all right. I'm fine with that. For down the road, it's unfamiliar to, people will encounter unfamiliar words. But let's stay inside the boundary of every word is something they already know, and so it's just not recognized. Either way, both cases, they're streaming along and they hit a processing bog, a stutter in the flow because the word that they're looking at doesn't pop.
They don't recognize it. Yes.
Okay.
So how do you get it to pop? You say.
Yeah. So you're saying is that skip over it and it'll backfill.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that was one
in the example you used. In the example you used a few moments ago,
and I said
you told her to say blank and move on, and that would backfill.
That was one strategy that worked. Should that be used? No, that's simply one.
I agree with you. So that's one of the strategies.
You asked me what's causing the stuttering, and I gave you an example while I was reading with one kid, and they stuttered because they were over phoneticizing. They'd been over phoneticized. That's the only strategy they had. Yep. They weren't taught any other strategies other than sound out every letter in the word. What do teachers do when they come to a word? They tell a kid, sound it out. Well, the kid already knew that. The kid couldn't sound it out. That's why the kid stopped.
Yeah, and the reason they can't sound it out is because of the orthographic mess that the code is.
Oh, I think otherwise more than that.
Well, no. I mean, like I said to you last time, in Plato's day, he said we could read once we knew the letters of the alphabet.
Plato's dead. Plato's dead.
All right. All right. So
dead people.
Well, there's no phonics in in a transparent orthography.
Yeah, I wish there's unicorns too, but that doesn't mean we can incorporate them. We've got what we've got. We can't change the orthography.
Bang! There you go. There now you and Reed Lyon say exactly the same thing on that point.
Okay, what did I say?
That we can't change the orthography. No use thinking about it.
We can't change the. You think we can change the orthography of the English language?
I think we can make a virtual overlay to the orthography of the English language that doesn't change it at all, but that makes it imminently more learnable by being elastic and dynamically responsive to every time anybody stutters recognizing a word.
Can you simple that up a little bit? I'm kind of a simple man. What does that mean?
Well, you touch a word and the word comes up and it guides you through how the letters correspond to the sounds in it.
Touch a word like on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that sounds like an interesting thing.
Yeah, if you
There's a
got,
lot of strategies.
I didn't mean to get us here, but we are here. So if you don't mind me taking a couple of minutes with this, I'll show you.
I'm
No, if you're frustrated, we can stop it here.
not frustrated, but I think it takes away. There's a lot of different strategies to make the code more visible, to make the patterns more visible. And the idea that there's one particular program or thing
I
is
don't think there's one particular program or thing. I do think that everything everybody thinks about teaching reading is warped around accepting the immutability of the orthography. That's a 16th century problem. We have the technology to overlay the orthography in a way that will allow uh, learners who come to a word with all kinds of differences to be able to get whatever they need to rapidly recognize and understand it and move along. And that
that's a topic for next time to look at that.
we can do that on a global level for every word on the internet.
Why don't you send me that and I'll look at it between now and then? How's that?
Okay.
I'm very interested. I'm for anything that works, David.
See, to me, this what I'm describing works really well with the whole language paradigm. All right, it's I'm I'm as much in conflict or more in conflict with the phonics side of the house that insists on teaching kids to have abstractly trained mental reflexes to work through code confusion. That's to me, that's just bizarre. So, in a way, I'm more spiritually kindred with your direction, but I want to take orthographic confusion completely out of the loop and then say we can be more meaning centric more rapidly, more efficiently by changing the way kids learn to use the orthography, using an overlay to the orthography.
That sounds like a very interesting thing. I'd like to look at it. So why don't you
So,
send me that, and between our next conversation, I can have a look at that. It sounds very intriguing.
all right, we'll leave it there. Thank you. It's good. It's good. I mean, I think it's clumsy. It's different. It's different for me. I know it's different from you, and who knows? But I think it's helpful.
It definitely helpful. And here's the thing: I have the recording still going on because I think this is important. I think about much of what you say as I'm out riding my bike and other stuff. And it causes me to really think and either change my ideas a little bit. And yes, I do change my thinking, or else it really reinforces, it causes me to justify what I do think.
Yep.
So this
Same.
is incredibly invaluable, and I appreciate it, David.
Good. Me too. Thank you so much.